I am pleased today to introduce Michele Montgomery, who will be speaking about the topic, tackling domestic violence, and are we winning or losing? Michele has been with the Government of Alberta since 1984, working in a variety of problem areas, predominantly with family court and child protection. She has been specializing in the area of domestic violence and bullying since 2002. She is passionate about sharing her knowledge and educating the community to create safe environments where children and families can thrive. As a mother of two great kids, Michele works full-time and is also an avid community volunteer. Let's welcome Michele Montgomery.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I always welcome the opportunity to go out into the community and talk about a topic that I am so passionate about. And it's not an easy topic to talk about. It's not an easy topic to hear about and learn about, but it's so very important. And I hope as I move through my presentation, you will understand that this isn't a small issue, and it's not something that just happens in larger centers or in specific populations. I just came across this quote about a week ago, and I thought, oh my gosh, if that doesn't just say it all. So when the women's movement started, there was not even a term called domestic violence. It was just called life. And if you think back historically, where women were considered chattel, property of their husband, the rule of thumb that you could beat your wife as long as the stick wasn't bigger around than your thumb, those were all things that historically were acceptable. And even though legally they may not still be acceptable, you may be surprised at how some of those belief systems in some segments have not shifted significantly. Now, when I was approached about doing this presentation, you know, one of the comments made to me was, this has been so much in the media lately. And are we doing anything? Are we making any progress? So I just want to talk for a moment about some significant progress that has been made with respect to domestic violence, specifically in Alberta. So around 1968, the women's movement started to get some feet under it. In 1974, the first women's shelter in Alberta, and in fact, I was told yesterday, in Canada, opened in Calgary. Now, that women's shelter at that time was entirely privately funded, so there was no government funding provided for that. In 1983, we saw some significant changes around spousal assault policies amongst policing divisions across the province, across the country actually, including Alberta. If you're not familiar with what a spousal assault policy would be, this is where the onus was taken off the victim to lay the charge. Prior to 1983, police might be called out to an incident and the victim, typically the woman, would be asked, do you want to lay a charge? There are many, many reasons why a woman would choose not to lay a charge, and not because she didn't think it was very important. That would probably be at the bottom of her list. So post-1983, police lay the charge. 10 years later, in 1993, we saw changes to the criminal code that allowed for criminal harassment to be a charge, and this would include stalking. And we know that stalking is a very significant issue within domestic violence, and it's one of probably our biggest red flags in terms of predicting lethality for a potential victim. So very important change there. In 1999, the Government of Alberta proclaimed the Protection Against Family Violence Act, which again is a wonderful piece of legislation that allows for victims to remain in their own home following a domestic violence incident and for the perpetrator to be removed. It also provides for lots of other forms of protection within that order. I'm not going to get into details about that, but very important piece of legislation. Unfortunately, right out of the gate, it had lots of issues being embraced. Not just necessarily by police, more by the judiciary and in the way that they were interpreting the act. So amendments were made in 2007 to try to address some of those issues, and then again in 2011 we saw that act opened again for more amendments to tighten it up and make it an even more useful piece of legislation. In 2004, the Child Welfare Act was replaced by the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act, and embedded right in that legislation, it indicates that children are deemed to be emotionally injured if they have been subjected to domestic violence. So makes our job much easier in terms of finding a way into that family to help them and to work with them. In 2005, the Government of Alberta hosted the Roundtable on Family Violence. This was actually very pivotal in the province of Alberta because the government called together stakeholders from almost every sector that would be dealing with families, and a number of recommendations came out of the Roundtable. Since the Roundtable, there's been a much greater focus on collaboration and coordinated responses. So the police don't just do their job, and the Crown Prosecutor doesn't just do their job, and child protection goes off and does their piece. We all work together to try and formulate the best possible plan for the family. There's more dollars available for treatment programs for offenders, which is very important. It's very, very important to support the victims, but really if you focus entirely on the victim and just punish the offender and don't offer any kinds of supports, the chances of them changing their behavior are not very great, which means they're probably going to go either back to that family or create a new family or a new relationship and continue their offending pattern. There's more emphasis placed on supporting our Aboriginal communities and our immigrant populations. Lethbridge is one of the top 10 placement cities in Canada for new Canadians, and with many of these immigrant populations, they bring their own issues, and they're very complex issues because of language barriers, because of cultural beliefs, because many of them have been in camps and have lived a lifestyle that we can't even begin to appreciate. So not exactly your run-of-the-mill kinds of families to deal with. We also now offer safe visitation for families who have been experiencing domestic violence to ensure that children can still have contact with the non-custodial parent, but in a very safe and protective environment to ensure that those visits are positive for the children, as opposed to potentially re-victimizing them or once again exposing them to the possibility for domestic violence by mom and dad having an altercation or a heated argument or something like that. There have been significant public awareness and education campaigns across the province. Since 2005, there's been a lot of focus on educating the public about what is family violence and why do you need to be concerned. And the Family Violence Info Line was also established, which is a 24-hour-a-day toll-free number that anyone can call for information about resources in their area. So, and then in 2013, just last year, the Alberta Family Violence Death Review Committee was established. Now, they've had a death review committee in Ontario for a number of years. We've had some extreme cases of domestic-related homicide in our province. And of course, every time one of those things happens, the key players that are sort of central to that do get together and talk about, wow, what happened? How could we improve? But really, it helps to have a body of experts in the field that are sort of at arm's length that can look at all of those cases and see, are there specific areas where we're just not getting the job done? Are there better ways that we can communicate? What can we do to prevent these situations from happening? You may not know this, but Alberta has consistently one of the highest rates of domestic violence in the country. Women between 15 and 24 are most at risk, and that's in terms of in an intimate relationship. So we know that there are girls as young as 12 years old in what they consider an intimate relationship who are being mistreated. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're being beat up, But it could be they're being controlled, everything that they do on their cell phones is being tracked by their boyfriend, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the reason it's that age group that's most at risk is because many of those young women don't have the relationship skills that they need to understand the difference between a healthy and an unhealthy relationship. Same would go for the boys in that age group. So one of the things that we are doing is we're trying to enhance curriculum within the schools to talk more about healthy relationships. Schools are tired of talking about bullying and bullying behavior, and I understand that. Sometimes it does become a word that's been overused. But if we can concentrate now more on what is a healthy relationship, how do you know if you're not being treated respectfully? Things like that, that will go a long way to preventing some of those more violent relationships from growing. So between 2008 and to date, 2014 isn't over yet, there have been 106 family violence-related deaths in Alberta. So this could be a single homicide, a multiple homicide, or a homicide-suicide situation. So that 106 number would capture all the victims, whether they were a bystander that was murdered or whether it was the offender and then killed himself. So that's not 106 separate incidents, but it's still an alarming number. 76% of those victims were female, and 24% were male. So one of the things that I do get asked a lot is, with all of this attention on the NFL and the NBA right now, are we finally going to see some changes? I would invite you all to think back to, let's go all the way back to 1988 and Mike Tyson. He severely assaulted his then wife. Let's go back to 1994. O.J. Simpson murdered his wife and a bystander, essentially, allegedly murdered his wife, sorry. These situations aren't new. This isn't the first time this has been in the media. We've had lots of high-profile things happen in our own backyard. How many of you remember the triple murder homicide that occurred in Claire's home just a few years ago? He killed his ex-girlfriend. I mean, we like to talk about the fact that it was these baseball players that died, and that was tragic. But the reality is they were bystanders. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't after them. He was after his ex-girlfriend. So we like to think that all of a sudden, because the NFL seems to be stepping up and it's hitting the front pages, that we'll see some movement. Maybe we will. I'm guardedly optimistic that there will be some good things come out of this. But realistically, we don't need to look to the NFL or the CFL or the NHL or anywhere else to find issues of domestic violence. They're happening in our own city. Are y'all having fun? Because I know this is a lot of fun. Good. Some things I want you to think about, and the most important one is most men do not abuse their families, okay? And I do speak predominantly of women as victims and men as abusers. That's not to say that there aren't women abusers, and that's not to say that there aren't female victims or offenders. It can happen both ways. But statistically, the majority of victims are women and the majority of abusers are men. But that's not because all men are abusive. When we talk about male victims, we need to remember that even though males can be victims, women are far more likely to suffer a serious injury. They're far more likely to seek a no-contact order or a restraining order, and they will more frequently report fearing for their lives. And I'm going to talk about another statistic that's even more demonstrates the fact that when we talk about victims, it is women we need to be most worried about. 49% of female murder victims are killed by an intimate partner. So For every 2 female murder victims, one of them was killed by someone who supposedly cared about her. 7% of male murder victims have the same rule apply. So it's easy to say men are just as often victimized as women. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but they're certainly not killed as often. So national rates of domestic violence have been relatively stable for the past 10 years. Sounds like a good news statistic. Behind that is, prior to that, they were actually declining. So national rates were on the decline. 10 years ago, they plateaued, and they've remained relatively stable since then. I have no idea why. We as taxpayers are spending about $100 million annually on domestic violence here in Alberta. Now, some of that is good news dollars. It's on our public awareness and education campaigns. It's on our support services. But a big chunk of that is what we're paying in court costs, in policing costs, in emergency room visits, things like that. So it's not a cheap business to be in. I find this very alarming. This is from 2012. It was a telephone survey done by Leger Marketing, which is a very renowned marketing research company. Nearly 1 in 10 men in Alberta that were surveyed agreed that it may be acceptable to physically assault a woman if she did something to incite the anger. So only if she deserved it. Only if she deserved it. Exposure to domestic violence is the #1 reason for child protection involvement in Alberta. It tends to run almost neck and neck with neglect. Some years, neglect will be 5% higher. Some years, exposure to domestic violence will be higher. However, the hidden statistic there is that's the #1 reason that we are initially contacted and become involved. The reality is, once we get involved with families for any reason, that statistic jumps to anywhere between 60 to 80% of our caseload involves families who have issues with domestic violence. And exposure to domestic violence has extreme societal costs, comes with a wide range of social and emotional problems for children. So we not only see that these kids typically are more inclined to be bullies, but they're also equally as inclined to be victimized by a bully, and not necessarily the same child. Some kids will flip both ways. Some kids tend to be more prone to being victims. Some kids are primarily just bullies. And then they take that with them into adolescence and young adulthood as they are embarking on interpersonal and intimate relationships, that they will tend to be more frequently victimized in a domestic violence relationship or the perpetrator in a domestic violence relationship, because it's what they know. That's their normal. So what's happening in Lethbridge? In 2013, we had 286 women and 331 kids that were allowed to stay at the YWCA Harbour House's Women's Emergency Shelter. 41% of those women reported that their life had been threatened. During that same period of time, 437 women and kids were turned away because the shelter was full. Now, when I say turned away, that doesn't mean they're just told, the door's locked, sorry, there's no room in the inn. They may be offered transport to another shelter in the area that has space for them. If they have extended family that's not in the immediate area that they would feel safe going to, assistance with bus tickets would be provided to them. In a worst case scenario, if they really don't feel that they can return to their home safely, they may be put up in a hotel, but that is not a best case scenario, given that a hotel isn't particularly secure. The whole point of going to shelter is that you are safe as long as you are within those walls. He has no opportunity to access you. Other services that the YWCA Harbour House offers is an outreach program. So a woman doesn't have to come into shelter to receive services. She can contact the shelter and say, you know what, I'm just not sure that I want to leave, but I want to talk to somebody so I know what that might look like. She might say, I'm not ready to leave, but I know I need help. Or she may have left the shelter, but does need ongoing supports for herself and her children. And that outreach services are also available to men through the shelter. Our shelter here will only house women and children, but outreach services are available to either men or women. They also have a crisis line, and in 2013 dealt with 1,668 crisis calls. So that's several a day. Am I shattering your dreams of what a placid, beautiful community this is to live in? Because I don't mean to, and Lethbridge is not really unique. This is very typical of what you would see across Alberta and in many other provinces. From a police perspective, in 2013, they responded to 1,134 incidents of domestic violence. That's about 3 a day. So again, please don't think it's not happening here. It's happening lots here. This was a 10% increase from 2012, but this was the first increase that we've seen in the number of calls that they've gone out to since 2009. So from 2009 to 2012, there was sort of a gradual decrease every year, and then last year it jumped. So even though it's gone up, it's still not as high as it was in 2009. The 618 charges were laid, and I don't have statistics for 2013. The last time the Crown Prosecutor's Office kept statistics was 2011, and at that point they had about a 70% conviction rate on domestic violence charges. So police are charging lots, we're getting lots of convictions. That's all very good, but what's more important is what's the outcome of that conviction. Many of these offenders are going back to their families. Many women have gone into shelter and then returned to their abuser. There's lots of reasons for that. Domestic violence is an incredibly complex issue. And I hear people say all the time, why does she go back? Or why doesn't she leave? Well, realistically, we need to ask ourselves, why can't she leave? Because there are multiple barriers to a woman being able to leave an abusive situation, and I could do a whole 30-minute presentation on that alone. And the same thing with him returning to that family after court proceedings are through. Very few men spend time in jail for domestic violence, and again, that's not a bad thing, because when they're in jail, they don't have to participate in any kind of treatment. So unless there's jail time and a probation order that requires treatment following jail time, he may or may not get help. If there's an order that requires him to attend offender treatment, he will get some help. So again, when we look at charges, 75% of those charges were against men, 18% were against women, 7% both parties were charged. This statistic has actually come down. Police used to much more frequently lay what they call dual charges, and this is because they go out, and if any of you have ever witnessed a domestic violence situation, you know it's very chaotic. And even when police get there, everybody doesn't just calm down and speak rationally and explain very clearly what exactly just happened. It's not like that. So sometimes it can be very difficult for police to figure out who was actually the offender and who was the victim here, because they're both saying, he started it, she hit me, I react, he did something. So sometimes they will they will lay dual charges. So what now? Family violence is complex, as I just said. It's pervasive. I hope you've got that picture. It's expensive, and it's preventable. It is preventable. In order to prevent it, we have to continue to embrace comprehensive continuum of supports. So we can't just deal with treating the offender. We can't just support the victim. We need to focus on awareness. We need everyone in the community to know to some degree what I've just shared with you, that this is not an isolated problem. It's happening everywhere. We need to talk about prevention. So as I said, getting into the schools and teaching kids from an early age what a healthy relationship is, and how do you know when you're in a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship. We need to continue our efforts at intervention, so treating offenders, treating and supporting victims, and providing that outreach, not just necessarily helping those people while they are in the throes of the situation or the immediate aftermath, but ensuring that they have adequate supports carrying on so that they don't revert to those kinds of behaviors. We need to do a better job of engaging men and boys, and I have to tell you, I don't often get to present to audiences where there are so many men present. We have historically seen family violence as a women's issue, and it's not. It's a societal issue. And if we don't get men on board, taking a stand and saying to those 1 in 10 men, it is not okay to ever hit your spouse, demean your spouse, be disrespectful to your spouse, it's not okay, then women are going to continue to fight this uphill battle trying to win everyone over. Prevention is the key. Prevention is the key. And we know for every dollar spent on intervention, there's at least a $7 saving. Prevention, you save $7 for every dollar that you invest. So we can't stop having these conversations. We can't stop making people aware. And we have to, as a society, stand up and talk about things like, okay, all these guys in the NFL, they're doing this. What are we going to do about it? Well, you can't do anything about the NFL, but let's talk about those the hazing things that happen on high school football teams and make it clear to school administrators and coaches that that's not okay. Like, you're setting a really poor example and a very bad precedent for what these young men think about relationships with each other and how that transfers in terms of their intimate relationships. What can you do? Don't be active bystanders. Don't just stand back and say, well, my family's good, my work site's good, everything's good. Because it's happening somewhere close to you, I can assure you that. Be engaged citizens. You, this group in particular, I know that you're all very engaged citizens. So think about what you can do to turn things around. What difference can you make in your community, within your own family? Support family, friends, and neighbors to get help when they need it. It's a tough conversation to have. I've had family violence within my own extended family. Not a comfortable conversation to have, but necessary. So do what you need to do to get past your own inhibitions and have that conversation. And help them know where to get help. And if you don't know where they can get help, again, the Family Violence Information Line, 310-1818, is a great place to start. Stop the transmission of violence from one generation to the next. I'll tell you, having that conversation with one person significant in your life that you think is struggling is going to be the first step to stopping that multi-generational issue. Family violence hurts everyone. The children, women, men, and families who experience violence, the witnesses and bystanders, as well as those who are responsible for committing the violence. And for any of you who ever have either been aware of a situation of family violence that is close to you or you've witnessed it, you know what I'm talking about. You don't have to be the person on the other end of that fist to feel the impacts. So again, I urge you to do what you can. November is Prevention of Family Violence Month in Alberta. If you think of things that you'd like to see happening in the community around Prevention of Family Violence Month, you're welcome to give me a call. There's a lot of people in this community that are trying to get the word out, but we can't do it alone. So again, I urge you to do whatever you can to deal with this issue. Thank you.